Hi, everyone. Welcome to our training. We're just going to give it a few more minutes to let other folks trickle in. I'm going to make a quick announcement on the chat bar with a link to another survey. So we would love for you to fill this out after the training so that we can get your feedback. And like I said, we'll just give it a little bit more time to let folks join. But thank you so much for being here. Hi, everyone. I see a bunch more people just joined. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to give it a little bit more time to let other folks join, and I'm going to add a link in the chat box to a survey that we'd love for you to fill out after this is over to get some feedback, and it shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. And like I said, we'll give it a couple more minutes to let folks trickle in, but thanks again for joining us today. Hi, everyone. We're at 1 o'clock. It's awesome to see over 100 of you here. We are going to give it a couple more minutes just to let folks continue to trickle in, but thank you so much for joining us today. And while we're waiting, just to make sure everyone has a chance to sign on, I'm going to add a link in the chat box to a survey that we would love for you to take at the end of this training so that we can get some feedback and see how we've done and see what else we can do to work with you all. So just a couple more minutes and we should get going. Just give it one more minute to make sure there aren't any other last-minute additions. As I mentioned a couple of times in the chat box, there's a link to a survey we've put together. We'd love for you to fill it out after this training to let us know how we did and what else we can help train you on. So appreciate that in advance. And it looks like we're right at 1:02, so why don't we jump in and get started since we only have an hour together. So, welcome everyone again. Thank you so much for being here today. Today, we're going to do a deep dive on sole source procurement for POS and PSA contracts. And we're really excited to have so many of you here. Looks like we're almost at 150 participants. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be with us. So I just want to introduce by name a couple of other folks who are here with me today. I have Kimberly Kennison, the Executive Financial Officer at OPM. She'll have some remarks in a couple of minutes. And also with us today are Colin Earhart and Lars Benson. They are fellows with the Harvard Kennedy School Government Performance Lab, or the GPL, and they're embedded with OPM and also DAS and OEC. And they are huge and integral members of our team and our procurement reform efforts. And they'll be assisting mostly behind the scenes and monitoring the chat. And so I'm really grateful to them and always for their help. And just before we get started, a quick note about the presentation. This is a Teams live event, so you're muted, but you can ask questions via the Q&A chat function that you should see on the side of your live screen. Those questions will be submitted, and myself, Colin, and Lars will be moderating. We'll be monitoring them throughout the session, and then at the end of the session, we will have a Q&A period to address some of those questions directly. But I really encourage you to ask as many questions as come to mind, because even if we can't get to a question you had today, I will send out a document with all the questions we were asked and responses to all of them after the event. So please ask away. Don't be concerned if you don't see your responses published. Colin and Lars are monitoring everything, and we'll be sure to get a handle on everything. And then finally, I've said it a million times, I'll say it one more time. I've posted a link to a survey in the chat box. I'll bring it up again at the end of the training, but these surveys are really helpful for us to learn how we're doing, whether these trainings are useful, and to help us understand what else we can train you on in the future. So with that, I'd love if we can go to the next slide, please. Great. So I'm going to just start by walking us through and giving us a sense of what we're going to cover today. So first, we're going to orient everyone and share some background on OPM's procurement reform agenda. And this is really important because this topic on sole source non-competitive procurements is really an important part of that agenda. From there, we're going to go over some basics of procurement. For those of you who attended our February training event, this will be a little bit of a review of those materials, but it will hopefully be helpful in allowing us to understand non-competitive procurement. Also, I want to take this chance to highlight that today's training is focused specifically on personal service agreements and purchase of service agreements. Those are PSAs and POSs. So these materials today are going to be a little bit more tailored to that realm of procurement, and it will not cover DAS procurement. So these processes that we're going to go over are pretty specific to PSA and POS procurements. After that review, we'll go over what non-competitive procurement is and when and how to do it. And we'll talk about justifying a non-competitive procurement and communicating with the OPM finance team, myself, Kim, Colin, and Lars about your non-competitive procurement. We'll dedicate some time to reviewing all of the waiver codes that we use to justify non-competitive procurement. And from there, we're going to leave some time for questions and answers. And as I mentioned, ask away. And so from there, let's jump into the agenda, and I'm going to hand it over to Kimberly Kennison, the Executive Financial Officer and head of the procurement team at OPM, to bring us through the next slide.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? I hope I'm connected, right? Good. I want to echo Julia's thanks to everyone for joining us today for another training session. We're excited to be doing that, and we appreciate your participation and hope that you find this helpful. I want to kick off by sharing some content as to why it is important for you all to understand our policies and procedures on non-competitive procurement. You may be aware that in August of 2019, Secretary McCaw sent a memo to all agency heads sharing heightened expectation on competitive procurements. She then established a procurement reform team to implement initiatives to increase competitive procurements. As you may remember from last training session, the competitive procurements ensure that the state is spending taxpayer dollars responsibly, ethically, and getting the best value and quality services for our residents. Our initiative ensures that we are using competitive procurements as much as possible. And these efforts include more transparency, better data collection, and as well as activities like procurement planning and additional trainings. As Julia will describe in detail in this presentation, there are, of course, cases where reform, there are cases when competitive procurement is not feasible and or appropriate. So we want to make sure that OPM's procurement reform, and that we want to encourage you to use non-competitive procurement when necessary and only when it's necessary, and to complete the process correctly to avoid delays and any kind of confusion. We want to mention that my team issues 2 regular reports that provide data on competitive procurements by all agencies. We issue these reports on a monthly basis, and one of them is called the Sole Source Waiver Report, and it shows all waivers that OPM has granted for POS and PSA contracts. We also include data in our POS and PSA annual reports on whether each contract was competitively procured. This also allows us to ensure that non-competitive procurement solicitations are limited to those cases where it is necessary. And it also tracks the progress of us increasing our state's competitive procurement. So both of these reports can be found on OPM's website. And I will now hand it over to Julia to walk us through those necessary cases for non-competitive procurement and what that might look like, and how you can work with us to get approval. So thanks again for joining us, and I'm handing it back to Julia to walk you through this presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Kim, for that really helpful overview and orientation. And hopefully that helps everyone understand a little bit about why we think this training is important. As I mentioned, now I'm just going to go back over some of the basics of what procurement is. And so the definition of procurement is sourcing and acquiring the goods and services that the state needs to do business. And why do we have a formal process for this? Well, there are a couple of reasons. First, we want to get the best quality services at the best prices for our state and for our residents. We're also using public funds, so we need to be sure that we're spending carefully. We want to avoid any conflicts of interest and unethical conduct, so making sure that there's no favoritism and that there's no bias in who's winning contracts. And also, really importantly, the procurement process allows us to ensure that vendors are achieving optimal outcomes, and it gives us a mechanism to hold them accountable. Lars, can you hit the next slide, please? So now that we've reviewed again what procurement is and why it exists, I'm going to go back over specifically what competitive procurement is. And this is the process that the state uses to look for the best value option to obtain the services that the state needs. When I say best value, I mean both in terms of cost, we could be getting the best price, but also the best quality. And the way we do this typically for POS and PSA contracts is through a request for proposal process. A request for proposal is a document that a state agency issues to the public to request or solicit proposals for services to be provided. These RFPs, as we call them, request for proposals, have to be open, public, and fair, and they allow agencies to choose from a wide slate of possible options in terms of vendors. And since the competitive process is so key in helping us achieve our procurement goals around outcomes, quality, and ethics, if an agency is looking to waive this process that helps us achieve our procurement goals, they need to get approval because it's sort of outside the norm, and we have to use other mechanisms to ensure that we're still achieving our procurement goals. Next slide, please. So hopefully that was pretty quick, but that was a helpful refresher on what procurement is, especially for those of you who are at our last training. It should be old news. But now that we've gone back over that, I want to talk about what non-competitive procurement is. And as I noted at the end of the last slide, the competitive process helps us achieve our procurement goals. So we try to use that process whenever we can. But there are absolutely instances where competitive procurement, an RFP process, is not feasible. And the goal of this training is to understand when these situations arise and to help us limit the use of non-competitive procurement to just those cases. So with that in mind, let's talk about some examples of situations that make a competitive procurement either difficult or impossible. The first example that I highlight here is on emergency or urgent need. Unfortunately, I think we all, yep, that's the slide. Unfortunately, I think we all are all too familiar with this. The COVID-19 emergency provided plenty of examples. We needed to get certain services to our agencies and to our residents. A great example is COVID testing. And those services needed to be stood up so quickly that an RFP process was not feasible. And so sometimes we do have urgent needs that make a competitive procurement not feasible. And other situations include when there's a limited vendor pool. Maybe you're looking for a service that is licensed or proprietary, and there's only one provider that has that service. Or maybe your service is so unique or specific that there's really only one person or organization that can do it for you. And another really common example is that a law or a funder might impose some limitations on the vendor pool. So if you have federal government dollars, the federal government might say you have to work with municipality X and you don't have a choice. Or there are some cases where statute or public acts might say you have to do this program with a specific vendor. And so those are cases where it's truly not feasible to do a competitive procurement, or in some cases it would be against the law. So with that in mind, these are some examples. I'll go in more detail later. But from this point forward, I might interchangeably use the terms non-competitive procurement and sole source procurement. And I just want to draw out here that the reason the term sole source procurement comes from the notion that we're only soliciting or considering one source, a sole source. So now to the next slide, please. Okay, so now that we understand a little bit about why a non-competitive procurement might make sense, let's talk about how to do a non-competitive procurement. And as a reminder, this is specifically for POS and PSA contracts. So this is sort of an overview, a very simplified overview of the process. And of course starts with determining a need. So you say to yourself or within your agency, we need XYZ services, either for our agency or for the residents we serve. And from there, the first thing you're going to do is ask yourself whether it should be competitive or non-competitive. And this is a tricky process for sure. It is definitely an art, not a science, to make this decision. And it's something that needs to really be done in collaboration with both program folks and fiscal or contracting folks. So the person submitting the requisition and helping make sure the budget and funds are there needs the help of the program person to understand the nature of the service and whether it might be something that they can bid out for or not. So we'll talk a little bit more about that art, not science, as this presentation goes forward. But from there, if you decide it's going to be competitive, you will do the RFP competitive process, get a contract together. That's not this training, but I think many of you are familiar with what that looks like. If it's non-competitive, you kind of get to this next question of whether you need a new contract or an amendment. So just keep in mind that an amendment that extends the term of a contract and adds more funds can be considered a sole source procurement if you're choosing to continue to give additional work to an existing vendor rather than soliciting bids from a new group of contractors. And so there are cases where your contract will say you can have 2 one-year extensions. And in those cases, it is still in your head a juncture where you should be asking yourself, are we happy with this contractor, or do we need to solicit new bids? So just keep that in mind sort of logically, that there might be cases where you're doing an amendment, but it's sort of akin to a sole source procurement because you're declining to go back out to bid. So from there, either if it's a contract or in almost all cases, an amendment that adds funds will require OPM approval. And I explained earlier, it's because we're stepping outside that standard of doing a competitive procurement. And so OPM Finance, our procurement team, is going to require overview and approval. And then once we issue that approval, you can move forward with the contracting process. So let's talk a little bit about that approval process and what we're looking for. Lars, if you can go to the next slide, please. So how do you, well, actually, before we get over into the realm of the actual process for getting OPM approval, let's revisit this conversation about how to decide whether a procurement should be competitive or non-competitive. I mentioned it's an art, not a science, and that it should be really a collaboration between program staff and fiscal or contract staff. And a great place to start answering these questions is in the